What would you do if the only home you'd ever known was stolen from you with a piece of paper? For Fanny Marsh, a quiet woman of 29 in the vast, unforgiving expanse of 1870s Colorado, this wasn't a question. It was the cold iron truth. She was driven from her late father's valley homestead by a cattle company that claimed her deed, the paper he'd treasured his entire life, was a forgery. But the truth waiting for her in the shadow of a shunned and forgotten silver mine would not only challenge the most powerful men in the territory, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of how being cast out can sometimes be the only way to find your way home. The dust of the road clung to the hem of Fanny's worn wool skirt, a second skin of grit and defeat. She stood before the Providence Gulch Mercantile, the false-fronted buildings of the town looming like judgmental elders. In her hand, she held the notice from the Sterling Cattle Company. The ink was stark and merciless against the cheap paper, declaring her father's deed to their quarter section null and void. A clerk's error from decades past, they called it. A clerical oversight that just so happened to favor the largest and most powerful ranching outfit west of the Divide. Fanny had ridden into town that morning with a quiet hope, a belief in the simple fairness of things. She'd stood before the county clerk, a man with a perpetually sweating brow, and presented her father's papers. He hadn't been able to meet her eyes. He'd merely pushed the Sterling Company's notice across the counter, his finger tracing the signature of its regional director, Elias Thorne. "I'm sorry, Miss Marsh," he'd muttered. "Their claim is formidable." Now, leaning against the rough sawn planks of the mercantile wall, the weight of her loss settled not in her mind, but deep in her bones. She remembered her father, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the mountains that cradled their home, pressing the deed into her hand just before he'd passed the winter before. "This is more than paper, Fan," he'd rasped, his voice thin as autumn smoke. "This is sweat. This is roots. Don't let anyone ever tell you it ain't yours." The memory was a fresh pain, a hot coal in the pit of her stomach. She had failed him. The town bustled around her, a river of noise and indifference. Men in dusty hats tipped their brims to passing ladies, their glances sliding right past Fanny as if she were a ghost already. She was a woman alone, without land, without family, without a single dollar to her name beyond the few coins in her pocket, meant for salt and flour. Her world had been reduced to what she could carry: the clothes on her back, a small satchel of her mother's things, and the aging, sad-eyed mule, Jedediah, currently tied to the hitching post, his ears drooping in sympathetic misery. Elias Thorne himself had ridden past not an hour ago, his horse a fine, glossy black that seemed to sneer at Jedediah's dusty coat. Thorne had met her gaze, a flicker of triumphant cruelty in his eyes, before turning away. He hadn't needed to say a word. The message was clear: you are nothing. You are gone. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The air grew colder. People were heading home, to warm stoves and evening meals. Home, the word was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. She couldn't go back to the homestead. Thorne's men were likely already there, running her few chickens and turning their cattle onto her father's carefully tended pasture. She had nowhere to go. A gust of wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of pine and the deeper, colder smell of the high country. It also carried a memory, another one of her father's stories, told on a winter night by the fire. He'd spoken of the old Silence Mine, a failed silver strike up the canyon, sealed and abandoned 30 years ago. He'd mentioned a small, unclaimed parcel of government land beside it, a piece nobody wanted because it was too rocky, too steep, and too close to a place the townspeople refused to speak of. A place of bad luck and buried secrets. At the time, it was just a story. Now, it was a destination. It was the only direction left to go. Fanny untied Jedediah's reins, her movements slow and deliberate, each one an act of defiance against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The mule nudged her shoulder with his soft nose, a silent question. She stroked his neck, her calloused fingers finding comfort in the familiar coarse hair. "It's just us, old boy," she murmured, her voice raspy. "We'll find a place." She swung herself up onto his bare back, her satchel clutched in one hand, the useless deed still crumpled in the other. She didn't look back at the town of Providence Gulch as she urged Jedediah toward the mouth of the canyon. She looked forward, toward the looming shadows of the mountains, toward the one place in the entire valley that was as forgotten and dismissed as she was. The path was steep and winding, leading away from the fertile valley floor and into the rocky throat of the high country. The air grew thin and sharp, with the scent of pine and cold stone. Every step Jedediah took felt like a step away from her past, from the life that had been ripped from her. The valley below, with its patchwork of ranches and the distant ribbon of the river, was a paradise she was being exiled from. Up here, the land was harsh, unforgiving, gnarled junipers clung to the stony slopes, and the wind had a lonely, keening sound. She rode until the last light bled from the sky, leaving only a wash of stars against an indigo canvas. Finally, she saw it. Set back from the trail, in a small, sheltered bowl of land, was the sealed entrance to the Silence Mine. It was a scar on the mountainside, a heap of rockfall and massive, weathered timbers jammed against the dark maw of the earth. A crude sign, faded and split, was nailed to a nearby pine. The words were barely legible. "Danger, keep out." It looked less like a warning and more like a gravestone. This was the dismissed object, the place of whispers and bad luck. The ground around it was rocky and uneven, dotted with hardy brush. But there was a small, relatively flat clearing a stone's throw from the entrance, sheltered by a granite outcrop. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a decent campsite. But it was unclaimed. It was a place where no one would bother her, because no one ever came here. She slid off Jedediah's back, her legs stiff and cold. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Even the crickets were quiet here. It was the kind of silence that felt ancient and watchful. This was what she was reduced to: a woman, a mule, and a ghost of a mine on a piece of land nobody wanted. She had traded her father's legacy, a place of life and memory, for a patch of dirt next to a tomb. What secrets was this mountain holding? Was the mine truly just a place of bad luck? Or was there something more buried with the silver? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Fanny's incredible story. As she stood there in the chilling darkness, little did she know that the ground beneath her feet held the answer not just to her own future, but to the stolen past of the entire valley. The next morning, Fanny rode Jedediah back into Providence Gulch for the few supplies she could afford. The town felt different now. Yesterday, she had been a resident, a landowner facing a dispute. Today, she was an outcast. As she walked toward the mercantile, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her," a woman muttered to her companion, clutching her basket tighter. "The Marsh girl. Lost the valley place." Another group of men standing outside the saloon fell silent as she passed, their speculative gazes making her skin crawl. They weren't just looking at a woman who'd lost her home. They were looking at a loose thread, a problem that had, for now, conveniently removed itself. Inside the mercantile, the clerk who had been friendly just a week ago was suddenly brisk and efficient, avoiding her gaze as he measured out a small bag of flour and a handful of beans. The transaction was cold, clinical. She was no longer a neighbor. She was Charity, or worse, a ghost haunting the edges of their prosperous lives. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, a voice, loud and dripping with contempt, cut through the street noise. Well, look what the mountain coughed up. It was Elias Thorne, leaning against a post, a smug grin spreading across his face. "I heard you found new lodgings, Miss Marsh. Getting friendly with the ghosts up at the Silence?" His laughter was a sharp, ugly sound. A few of his cronies, loitering nearby, joined in. Fanny felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze, her expression a mask of stony indifference. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned, loaded her meager supplies onto Jedediah's back, and prepared to leave. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "You run along," he called after her, his voice hard. "That's where people like you belong. In the shadows, with the other forgotten things." She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her back straight, each step a silent refusal to break. As she reached the edge of town, a figure stepped out from the narrow alley between the blacksmith and the livery. It was an old Ute woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a depth that seemed to span generations. The townspeople called her Salt Woman because she appeared only a few times a year to trade hides for salt, speaking to almost no one. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made the bustling town seem flimsy and temporary. The old woman raised a hand, and Fanny instinctively stopped. She reached out a dry, warm hand and placed it gently on Fanny's forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm, grounding. She looked from Fanny's face to the distant canyon where the mine lay hidden. "The mountain remembers," the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "What the valley forgets." That was all. She gave Fanny's arm a final, reassuring squeeze, then turned and disappeared back into the alley as silently as she had appeared. Fanny stood frozen for a moment, the woman's words echoing in the sudden quiet. The mountain remembers what the valley forgets. It was a riddle, a proverb, a warning. She didn't know what. But it felt like the first true thing anyone had said to her all day. It settled in her heart not as a threat, but as a sliver of strange, unasked for hope. What had the valley chosen to forget? And what did the mountain where she now slept have to do with it? The question followed her all the way back up the winding trail, a single, persistent note in the symphony of her loss. The journey back to her makeshift camp felt different this time. The cryptic words of the old Ute woman had shifted something in the landscape. The mountain no longer felt like a place of exile, but one of secrets. When she arrived, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the pines, casting long shadows across the sealed mine entrance. The place was still and silent, but it was a silence that now felt less empty and more expectant. Fanny slid from Jedediah's back and let him graze on the sparse patches of grass. She took a moment to truly study her new surroundings. The mine was sealed with a jumble of massive timbers and what looked like half the mountainside. It was a chaotic mess, designed to look like a natural rock slide, but the sheer volume of it seemed excessive. Why go to such trouble to close a simple failed mine? She unpacked her supplies, her movements methodical and calming. She built a small, careful fire in a ring of stones she'd assembled the night before, the smoke rising thin and straight in the still air. As dusk began to settle, she sat on a flat rock, sipping hot, weak tea from a tin cup, her gaze fixed on the dark heap of the mine. This was her first real night living beside it, her first conscious act of making this place a temporary home. The sounds of the high country began to emerge as the light faded. The hoot of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the high branches of the ponderosas. But from the mine itself, there was nothing. A profound, unnatural stillness. As she listened, she watched Jedediah. The mule, who was usually skittish in new places, seemed remarkably at ease. Instead of staying close to the fire, he wandered over to the edge of the rockfall, sealing the mine. He stood there for a long time, his head lowered, his long ears pointed forward, perfectly still. He wasn't sniffing the air or pawing the ground. He was just listening. It was an odd behavior. Her father had always said you could trust a mule's instincts over a man's word. Animals felt things humans missed, a change in the weather, the scent of a predator, the tremor of the earth. Jedediah's calm vigilance was unsettling. He wasn't afraid, he was attentive. It was as if he were listening to a conversation she couldn't hear. Fanny wrapped her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the growing darkness. She laid out her bedroll near the granite outcrop, using her satchel as a pillow. The rock at her back still held a faint warmth from the day's sun. Lying there, staring up at the brilliant spray of stars, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. She was utterly alone, a tiny speck of life clinging to the edge of a great, silent mystery. The mountain loomed over her, a vast, dark shape against the sky. It felt ancient, powerful, and indifferent. Yet, the old woman's words returned to her. The mountain remembers. Lying there in the cold, Fanny closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it remembered. She thought of the miners who had worked here, their hopes for a silver fortune. She thought of the collapse, the story everyone in the valley avoided. Had men died in there? Was that the source of the bad luck, or was it something else entirely? A strange peace began to settle over her. For the first time since receiving Thorne's notice, the frantic panic in her chest subsided. The path forward was gone, her past was barricaded. All she had was this moment, this place, and for reasons she couldn't name, her mule's quiet stillness beside the dark mine felt less like an omen of danger and more like an invitation to listen. What was Jedediah hearing in the deep silence of the mountain? A week passed. Fanny fell into a spare, hard rhythm of survival. Mornings were spent gathering firewood and checking the simple snares she'd set for rabbits. Afternoons were for mending her worn clothes or simply sitting, watching the light change on the face of the mountain. She was becoming a part of the landscape, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as the lichen on the rocks. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant companion. But it was slowly changing from a sharp pain into a dull, familiar ache. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the peaks. Rain came in blinding sheets, turning her small campsite into a muddy soup. Torrents of water cascaded down the mountainside, washing loose dirt and rock toward her lean-to. Fearing a mudslide, Fanny grabbed her father's old shovel, the one tool she'd had the foresight to tie to Jedediah's pack, and began frantically digging a diversion trench. The work was brutal. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her through to the bone, but a desperate energy fueled her. As she dug, her shovel striking rock and mud, she worked her way closer to the base of the mine's sealed entrance. The runoff was thickest there, sluicing away years of accumulated soil and scree. After the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping, Fanny stood panting, leaning on her shovel. Her trench had held. Her small camp was safe. It was then that she noticed it. The deluge had exposed something at the very bottom of the rockfall, the dark, glistening end of a wooden beam. It was different from the other timbers used to seal the mine. Those were rough-hewn pine logs, weathered to a silver gray. This piece was darker, denser, almost black with age and water. It looked like petrified oak, and it was set deeper, as if it were part of an older, buried structure. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt in the mud and began to clear the remaining debris from around it. Her fingers, raw and cold, scraped away dirt and pebbles. As more of the wood was revealed, she saw the carving. It wasn't a name or a date. It was a precise, deliberate symbol, a perfect square with a single, straight line drawn vertically through its center. She'd seen marks like it before, on the old boundary stones of her father's property. It was a surveyor's mark. But it was a variation she didn't recognize, and it was in a place that made no sense. Why would a surveyor's mark be on a timber used to seal a mine, buried under tons of rock? It didn't fit the narrative of a simple, accidental collapse. It felt intentional. It felt like a clue. She tried to pry the beam loose, but it was wedged tight, a silent testament to some long-forgotten purpose. She sat back on her heels, the dripping forest silent around her, and stared at the strange symbol. It was a piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving, a single, anomalous detail in a story everyone else had accepted as truth. For days she had been living beside the mine, seeing it only as a monument to failure and bad luck. Now, for the first time, she saw it as something else. It wasn't just a sealed hole in the ground. It was a message. She just didn't know how to read it yet. Leaving the timber where it lay, she returned to her fire, her mind racing. The symbol was a loose thread, and Fanny Marsh, with nothing left to lose, felt a sudden, fierce determination to pull on it. A few days later, a man on horseback rode up the trail. Fanny, wary, watched him approach from the cover of the trees. He wasn't one of Thorne's rough-looking ranch hands. This man was lean and wore practical, clean clothes. He sat his horse with an easy confidence, but his eyes, as they scanned the landscape, were sharp and methodical. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from her camp. "Miss Marsh?" he called out, his voice calm and even. Fanny stepped into the clearing, her hand resting on the handle of the small axe she used for firewood. "I'm Fanny Marsh." The man dismounted, holding his hat in his hand. "My name is Nathan Vale. The Sterling Company hired me to survey the disputed boundary lines." Fanny's heart sank. He was one of them. She braced herself for another dismissal, another smug assertion of Thorne's power. But Nathan's expression held no malice. It was serious, professional, and perhaps a little weary. "I'm not here to trouble you," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "My job is to measure the land, to record what is there. Nothing more." He had a quiet, direct way of speaking that she found herself trusting against her better judgment. Over the next few days, Nathan became a regular presence on the mountainside. He worked with a quiet intensity, setting up his transit, driving stakes, and making meticulous notes in a small leather book. He never intruded on her camp, but he would often greet her with a polite nod in the morning or a quiet good evening as dusk fell. One afternoon, he saw her staring at the exposed timber at the base of the mine. He walked over, his boots making little sound on the damp earth. "That's an interesting piece of oak," he said, his surveyor's eye immediately drawn to the carving. He knelt for a closer look. "Where did you find this?" "The storm washed it out," Fanny replied, watching him carefully. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He murmured, tracing the symbol with his finger. "That's a witness corner mark. An old one. Hasn't been used in 30 years. He looked from the beam to the chaotic heap of the mine seal, then back again. A witness corner is a reference point for a survey plat. It's used to mark a boundary line when you can't place a stone right on the corner itself. It points to the real marker. A slow dawning comprehension began to light in his eyes. This shouldn't be here. Not like this. His professional curiosity was piqued. The anomaly that had bothered Fanny now had a name and a function, and it was deeply out of place. While Nathan continued his official survey, a new kind of work began for Fanny. Driven by a purpose she hadn't felt in months, she started clearing the brush and loose rock from around the mine entrance. It wasn't a conscious decision to try and open it. It was a need to impose order on the chaos, to understand the shape of the thing she was living beside. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. She learned the weight and balance of the rocks, the grain of the broken timbers. Jedediah often stood nearby, his quiet presence a comfort. Her labor was a form of investigation. With every rock she moved, every piece of rotten wood she cleared away, she was learning the grammar of the collapse, and the more she cleared, the more it looked wrong. Some of the other timbers, as she uncovered them, also bore markings, faded, painted numbers, a 3 on one, a V on another. They seemed random, meaningless. She pointed them out to Nathan one evening as he was packing up his equipment. He came over, his brow furrowed in thought. He sketched the numbers and the witness mark in his notebook. "This wasn't a cave-in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This was a construction, or a deconstruction. These numbers, they look like a sequence. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a question that was as massive and immovable as the mountain itself. Why would someone go to the trouble of systematically burying a mine and marking it with a secret survey point? The numbers on the timbers became their guide. Nathan, with his knowledge of old engineering and survey methods, began to see a pattern. The numbers weren't random. They indicated a sequence for demolition, a precise and deliberate collapse designed to be permanent. They sealed it from the inside out, he explained, pointing to how the main support beams had been cut and blasted. And this rockfall, it was directed. All of it. The witness mark on the oak beam was the key. According to the old surveying manuals Nathan kept in his saddlebags, that particular mark pointed toward a true survey monument, usually within 100 feet. But there was no monument stone anywhere in the clearing. Unless, Nathan said, his eyes scanning the jumble of the rockfall itself, the monument isn't on the mountain. What if it's in it? Their focus shifted. They weren't just clearing debris anymore. They were searching for a hidden doorway. Following the logic of the witness corner and the numbered beams, they began to concentrate their efforts on a section of the rockfall to the left of the main entrance. It looked as solid as the rest, but some of the larger boulders seemed oddly placed, wedged together in a way that defied natural physics. It was backbreaking work. For 2 days, they labored together, using pry bars Nathan fetched from his camp and the sheer stubborn strength of their bodies. Fanny worked with a focused intensity, her grief and anger channeled into the physical act of moving stone. Nathan, caught up in the mystery, worked alongside her, his quiet respect for her growing with every hour. Finally, their pry bar slid into a deep crevice and met with a hollow sound. With a final, coordinated heave, they dislodged a massive flat stone. It fell away with a deep groan, revealing not a mineshaft, but a small, dark alcove, deliberately hidden within the structure of the collapse. It was a man-made cavity, dry and protected, and inside, sitting on a dusty rock-cut shelf, was a rust-eaten tin box. A profound silence fell over them, broken only by their ragged breaths. This was it, the heart of the secret. Fanny reached into the darkness, her trembling fingers closing around the cold metal. She lifted the box out into the light. It was heavy. The lid was rusted shut, but Nathan managed to pry it open with the tip of his knife. The contents were not silver, nor gold, nor any treasure a miner would seek. The box was filled with paper. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Beneath it, a bundle of letters, tied with a faded piece of twine. Fanny lifted the ledger with reverent hands. She opened it. The first page was a title plate, the ink still dark and clear in the dry air. Official Survey of the Providence Valley, it read. Commissioned by the Territorial Office, 1848, Amos Albright, Certified Surveyor. Nathan let out a sharp, indrawn breath. Amos Albright, he whispered. He was a legend, the best there was. The story is he took a job out here and just vanished. Fanny turned the page. It was a map, exquisitely drawn, of the entire valley. And there, clearly marked with precise coordinates tied directly to the witness corner at the Silence Mine entrance, was her father's homestead. Plot 7, and next to it, Plot 8, Plot 9, Plot 10, a half-dozen other small homesteads, all legally registered, all their boundaries immutable and clear. It was the original, true survey of the valley. Then she picked up the letters. They were from Albright to his wife. Her hands shaking, she read the last one aloud. My dearest Anna, it began. I have uncovered a terrible fraud. The Sterling Cattle Company, through its agent, has bribed the land office and intends to file a false survey, erasing the claims of the settlers in the Northern Valley. They know I have the true plat. I have been threatened. I fear for my life. I have hidden the original ledger where they will never find it. I have sealed the evidence inside the mountain itself. If anything happens to me, the mountain will remember the truth. Fanny looked up at Nathan, her eyes wide with the enormity of their discovery. The Silence Mine wasn't a failed silver strike. It was a tomb for the truth. It had been sealed to bury the proof of a crime that had stolen the valley, piece by piece, for 30 years. Her father's deed wasn't a forgery. It was the last echo of a truth everyone had been forced to forget. The discovery of the ledger changed everything, but it also presented a new, more dangerous problem. They held the truth in their hands, but Elias Thorne and the Sterling Cattle Company held the valley in their fist. Presenting the ledger to the same corrupt clerk who had dismissed Fanny's deed would be suicide. The book would simply disappear, and so, perhaps, would they. They needed a plan, but before they could form one, the mountain made a decision of its own. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the peaks, and the temperature plummeted. An early, vicious autumn blizzard, the kind that could kill a man in an hour, was bearing down on them. "We need to get you to town," Nathan said urgently, already moving to gather his things. But it was too late. The first flakes, thick and wet, were already falling. The wind rose to a piercing shriek, and the world dissolved into a blinding vortex of white. They scrambled for the shelter of Fanny's lean-to, reinforcing it against the granite outcrop as the storm hit with full fury. They huddled together, the wind tearing at their small refuge, the ledger and letters wrapped safely in oilcloth between them. The world shrank to the small circle of their fire and the howling darkness beyond. Hours passed. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying the landscape. Sometime deep in the night, over the roar of the wind, they heard a faint cry. A human sound. Nathan and Fanny exchanged a look. To go out in this was madness. To ignore it was unthinkable. Tying a rope around his waist and giving the other end to Fanny, Nathan ventured into the blizzard. He returned minutes later, half carrying a snow-caked figure. It was Elias Thorne. He was barely conscious, his face pale and his lips blue. His horse had thrown him, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He had been checking on his cattle on the high range, caught by the storm's sudden violence. Without a word, Fanny moved aside, making room for him by the fire. She tore a strip from her own spare blanket to make a crude splint for his leg, her movements deft and sure. She brewed the last of her tea and forced the hot liquid between his chattering teeth. Thorne, delirious with pain and cold, looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw the woman he had scorned, the woman he had driven from her home, now saving his life. "Why?" he croaked, the word a puff of frosted air. Fanny didn't answer. She just pulled another blanket over him, one of the two she owned. Nathan watched her, a look of profound admiration on his face. He had warned her earlier that day that a man like Thorne would never repay such a kindness. "I know," she had said simply. This act wasn't for Thorne. It was for herself. It was a quiet declaration. Her fight was not against a single, cruel man. It was for a principle. It was for the truth, and her humanity was not something she was willing to sacrifice to win. Sheltering her enemy in her meager camp, using her own scant resources to save him from the storm, she was committing fully to the person she was, the person her father had raised her to be. The ledger could prove she owned the land, but this act, in the heart of the blizzard, proved she deserved it. As the storm raged on, the three of them, the wronged, the witness, and the villain, were trapped together. A strange tableau of justice and mercy in the heart of the silent mountain. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was a pristine, silent wilderness of white. The snow was waist-deep, the air clean and bitingly cold. Thorne's fever had broken, but his leg was badly swollen. He was weak, humbled, and for the first time since Fanny had met him, utterly silent. His arrogance had been stripped away by the storm and her quiet, unhesitating compassion. Nathan, using makeshift snowshoes, made the arduous journey down to Providence Gulch for the doctor. He returned late the next day with Doc Abernathy, a kind, no-nonsense man who had tended to everyone in the valley for 40 years. The doctor examined Thorne's leg, setting the bone with practiced efficiency. "A nasty break," he said, "but you'll live. Thanks to Miss Marsh here." His eyes, full of a quiet intelligence, lingered on Fanny, then on the strange camp set up against a sealed mine. While he worked, Nathan laid the old ledger on a dry rock. "Doc," he said, "I think you need to see this." Abernathy wiped his hands and picked up the book. He opened it, his eyes scanning the title page. He went still. "Amos Albright," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "My God. I was just a boy, but I remember him. My father knew him. When he disappeared, everyone said he'd run off with the Survey Commission's money. The Sterling Company spread the story themselves." He turned the pages, his expression shifting from disbelief to dawning comprehension, and finally to a slow-burning anger. This changes everything." The journey back to town was a strange procession. Thorne was strapped to a litter dragged by Nathan's horse. Fanny rode Jedediah, the precious ledger held securely in her lap. When they arrived, word of Thorne's rescue and the reason for Nathan's journey had already begun to spread. People came out of their homes and businesses, not with whispers and averted eyes, but with open curiosity and a dawning respect. They saw Fanny Marsh, the woman they had dismissed, riding into town not as an outcast, but as a savior, carrying a truth that had been buried for 3 decades. At the county office, Doc Abernathy and Nathan presented the ledger to the sweating clerk. Faced with the unimpeachable evidence of the original plat, witnessed by the town's most respected doctor, the clerk's blustering defense of the Sterling deed crumbled. He unlocked a dusty cabinet and produced the official plat on file, a cruder, simpler map. It was a clear forgery. The news spread through the valley like a grass fire. Other families who had been forced to sell their land to the Sterling Company for pennies on the dollar over the years, who had been told their own deeds were flawed, began to appear. An old man came forward with a story of his father being threatened off his land. A widow spoke of a mysterious fire that had destroyed their barn just before they were forced to sell. Fanny's discovery hadn't just reclaimed her own home, it had given a voice to a generation of injustice. The Sterling Cattle Company, faced with a mountain of evidence and the collective fury of the valley, folded. Their lawyers sent word from Denver. They were withdrawing all claims based on the fraudulent survey and would offer financial restitution to the affected families. Elias Thorne was quietly recalled by the company, disappearing from Providence Gulch as suddenly as he had appeared, his public humiliation complete but private. The townspeople now looked at Fanny with a kind of reverence. She was no longer the Marsh girl. She was the woman who had listened to the mountain. The last rays of the autumn sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light. Fanny stood on the porch of her father's cabin, her home, now indisputably hers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the wood smoke curling from her chimney. The windows, which had been dark and empty for weeks, now glowed with the warm light of a lantern. She had come home. Nathan Vale stood beside her, leaning against a porch post. His work was done. The new old boundaries were being recorded, and the Sterling Company's fraudulent claims were being systematically dismantled. He could have left a week ago, but he had stayed. He looked out over the valley, a patchwork of gold and green stretching to the horizon. "It's a beautiful place," he said quietly. "Your father chose well." Fanny followed his gaze, but her eyes were drawn higher, toward the dark line of the mountains to the north, to the place where the Silence Mine lay hidden. She had no intention of reopening it. The silver within it was worthless compared to the truth it had guarded. It had served its purpose. It could rest now. "What will you do now?" Nathan asked, his voice gentle. The question hung in the peaceful air. She could sell. She could leave. She had been vindicated, and she was free. But as she looked at the fields her father had cleared, at the sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, she felt the deep, anchoring pull of roots. She had fought for a piece of paper, for a deed, for a legal right. But in the process, in the hardship and the discovery, she had found something more. She had found her place, not just on the map, but in the story of the valley itself. She finally turned her gaze from the mountain to the land before her, her land. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "My father left me a homestead," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening quiet. "But this valley, we earned that back together." Her words held the simple, profound weight of the story's moral. Inheritance wasn't just property passed down. It was a truth to be stewarded, a community to be restored. She had been cast out, only to find that in the wilderness, she had uncovered the very thing that would bring everyone home. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible journey. This has been a story about the enduring power of hidden truths, and how the things and people a world dismisses often hold the key to its healing. If you were moved by Fanny's story, we'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and unexpected discovery. We'll be back soon with the story of an old blacksmith who was given a single, rusted key and told it would open a future he never knew he had.